All right, should I start? Are you rolling? Okay. My name is John Collins. I'm been in Ghana since 1969 as an adult, but I was here as a child as well. And I've been involved in the Ghanaian and West African music scene since the 1960s or 1970s. Played with many bands, ran a recording studio in this very house where we're sitting now, Bokor House. Been teaching at Legon in the music department for 26 years, became a professor there. And also for the last 30 years, I've been running a Highlife museum or institute in this same premises, Bokor House. So I've been really involved in the music industry for a long time, but I didn't come to Ghana purposely to go back to my roots or discover African music, because I came here as a kid with my parents. So I was raised actually in Achimota when I was a small boy for a while. When I came to Ghana, I joined a concert party called the Jaguar Jokers. They were staying at my stepmother. My father married, after divorcing my mother, my English mother, then he married a Ghanaian lady called Auntie Ama, an Achim lady. So I met my first band through her, because in her house, one of the tenants was the leader of the Jaguar Jokers called Opia. And I was always, in those days, I always held a guitar. So they hijacked me in 1969 and took me on a village tour with the Jaguar Jokers. So I was playing the guitar, but not acting, just trying to learn to play Highlife. And then in the night we sleep on the floor and move to another village. So that's how I first met Ghanaian music, and I found it wonderful. And then I went to Legon to study a degree in sociology and archaeology. And I even taught chemistry and physics in Ghana, in Koforidua and at GIS in Ghana, in Accra. So I had a very varied background. So I can't say anything brought me to Ghana. Most certainly I didn't expect to end up by being a professor of music and an expert on Highlife or anything like this. We call it Nkrabia. Yes. It was largely a product of the Fantis, the Akans and the Gas, and to a lesser extent the Eves. And it took their indigenous music and combined it with Western ideas, because it was colonial times, we're talking during the colonial system. So they borrowed the harmonies, some of the instruments, the brass bands, the guitars and so on, trumpets, from the Europeans, and the missionaries introduced Western harmonies. So there was a Western influence in Highlife. So you can say the bedrock was African. In Ghana, particularly the Fantis, the Akans and the Gas. And then the Western elements coming outside, being fused with it. It's a fusion music, but then also very important in the birth of Highlife was the influence of the Black Americans and Black West Indians. And right from the very beginning, there was a Western influence in Ghana coming into an early form of Highlife, because the word Highlife wasn't invented till the 1920s. But we had styles of music which predate Highlife. One was called Adaha music from the Fantis, and the other was called Osibisaba, also from the Fantis. And the Adaha music in particular, that's the brass band variety of Highlife, was influenced by West Indian soldiers who brought Afro-Caribbean music. And later on, Highlife itself was influenced by jazz. So you can see that I would say that Highlife was born in Ghana, has got some pan-West African roots to it, connections, and is a combination of the African bass line, the roots if you want to put it that way, Western imports, and also a big influence from the Black Americas, both United States and the Caribbean. That's why we call Highlife a fusion music. It's a combination of the African, the Western, and the Black Americas. But born in Ghana, born in West Africa. Yeah. I was very lucky. You know, I wrote a book about E.T. Mensah back in the 70s. And when I was writing the book, E.T. took me to the older musicians. That is, the ones that came before E.T. Like his older brother, Yeboah Mensah, Squire Ado, Frank Torto. These guys go back to the 1920s. So this is where I got the information from. And it was Iti Mensah's older brother, Yeboah Mensah, who was running the Accra Rhythmic Orchestra back in the 1930s, who told me about the origin of the word highlife. And he said what happened is that even though there were different forms of highlife by that time, played by soldiers, played by sailors, poor people, the ballroom orchestras of the rich Ghanaians also started to occasionally play some of these, what we might call street music. And at first, you know, the ballroom orchestras didn't play any African music at all. You could say that they were affected by the colonial mentality. They played imported waltzes, foxtrots, ragtime, and so on. But somewhere, at some point, and an elderly lady told me this actually, who saw this when she was a small girl, that the highlife, it was for the rich people, so they had these dancing clubs, and they'd be playing their waltzes and foxtrots with people, you know, dancing together in couples, wearing very fine clothes. But occasionally they wanted to let their hair down, so they would pick a typical street music, what might have been called Osibisaba or Adaha music, and then they would do what they call a ring dance or a conga line. You know the conga line where the people dance around each other in lines? They would let their hair down. So what happened is some of the street music began to be orchestrated by the high-class elite ballroom dance orchestras. But the people who coined the name high-class life music or high life music were not the high-class people or the high-class musicians. It was the poor people who gathered outside the dancing clubs. You see, in those days there was a lot of class. It's British, you know, British class system. We have a system with the Queen at the top and people at the bottom and so on. So it was very class conscious. It depended on what you wore. So the poor people didn't have money in their pockets or the clothes to wear to get into the elite dance clubs. And suddenly they noticed, but they used to enjoy it on the pavements outside. Maybe they take their wives or girlfriends, the men, take some kelewele and some apateshi or something, you know, not expensive, enjoy themselves, do the ballroom dancing on the streets, outside of places like the Palladium Cinema, for instance, or there were many clubs like this in Ghana at that time for the rich. And then, of course, suddenly they heard their own music coming out, and they didn't have a name for it, so they called it high life music, high class life music, but it didn't mean that the elites invented high life. It had already been in Ghana for at least 30, 40 years before that, under different names. Even in Nigeria, they had something like high life. They called it native blues. So that was all around West Africa, these pre-high life forms of music. But the name itself got coined in Ghana in the 1920s by the poor people, according to Yeboah Mensah. It's there somewhere in my book, but maybe not said in that particular way. I've even got a picture in the book of the first reference to high life, which was, they had an orchestra called the Ragajazbo Orchestra, and it played in 1925 for the Cape Coast Literary Association, that included really, I mean, if you look at the names of the patrons, President Nana Addo's grandfather was there, I think, and also Casely Hayford, Sir Casely Hayford, one of the founders of Pan-Africanism. So all the big names were there, and it gives the list of the dances that were going to be played, and it mentions the name High Life, and it's the first evidence in the whole of West Africa to the name High Life. So it's 1925, Cape Coast, and it was the Cape Coast Literary Association. So the name was invented, or maybe invented in Cape Coast, we can say, we're not sure, but either there or Accra, because there were also orchestras in Accra operating as well at the same time. Yeah, that came from the Ghanaians who had been trained by the British in the colonial army, and then they hijacked British marching band music and Africanized it with the help of West Indians, because the West Indians were also, I think we had about nobody knows the number, between 6,000 and 8,000 West Indian soldiers stationed at Cape Coast and Elmina for the Ashanti Wars. So they also brought in Afro-Caribbean music. So that went into the mix. And then, of course, once the Ghanaians had realized you can play Afro-Caribbean music as well as Western music with brass bands, it was only a short distance to say, well, why not use our own rhythms? And that's how Adaha was born.
Then Osibisaba.
That came more from the fisher folk. What happened is that the crew sailors had developed this African way of playing the guitar, which uses an African plucking technique, which is different from the Spanish Western technique. And they spread it all down the West African coast, where sailors go everywhere. And in various countries, it sort of went into various forms of early popular music. For instance, in Sierra Leone, they had maringa music. So it uses the crew style of guitar picking. In Nigeria, they had juju music and native blues, which uses the crew style of finger picking for the guitar. And in Ghana, the Fantis picked it up, the Fanti fishermen, or in the coastal areas like Cape Coast, and they developed it into what we call the Osibisaba. And the earliest group that we know of was or people involved in this was a guy called George William Aingo, and also Kwesi Asare or Jacob Sam, who were the first to record around about 1928, late 20s. They recorded some of this Osibisaba music. So this was probably before the word highlife had become very popularized in Ghana, you see. So this is what Osibisaba. In fact, Kwame Nkrumah tried to get the name Highlife changed in around about 1960. He asked all the musicians in the country, or the important ones, to come to the Arts Council, Arts Centre, and because he was indigenizing in Ghana, so he wanted to get rid of the colonial name Highlife. But I think that Nkrumah didn't realize that the name was actually invented by poor Ghanaians. But anyway, he wanted to change it, and he picked the name Osibisaba, because that was the old Fanti name for Highlife. And in fact, there was a meeting and a vote, and I think that according to E.T. Mensah, people did vote to change the thing, but except E.T. Mensah voted against it, because he had been claimed the king of Highlife, not the king of Osibisaba. And moreover, by this time, Highlife had gone to Nigeria, had taken firm root in Nigeria and some other West African countries, so it was too late to change the name. So we're stuck with the name. Well, that would be one of the ballroom dance orchestras. We had about 20 bands in, some in Kumasi, some in Accra, some Winneba. I think even there was some in Koforidawa and so on. The Cape Coast Sugar Babies I can't remember, I think it was formed around about 1930. I think there were several bands in Cape Coast, in fact. There was one, I think, called, was it Dr. Graves Orchestra or something, but the Cape Coast Sugar Babies was the most famous for several reasons. One, it was the first of the ballroom dance orchestras to record Highlifes. So I've actually got Highlifes in my museum, recorded by them under the name Cape Coast Sugar Babies or Cape Coast Flower Babies. And these are very early Highlifes. And as I said, these orchestras didn't really concentrate on Highlife back in those days. But then the other reason they became famous is that they were the ones who took Highlife first to Nigeria. They went on a very extended tour of Nigeria in 1937-38 over the Christmas, I think. They went all over, Kano, everywhere. And when I went to Nigeria some years ago, the first quotations about Highlife in Nigeria, which Professor Tundi Vidal showed me, was a newspaper cutting from 1938 of the Cape Coast Sugar Babies introducing or playing Highlife in Nigeria. So this made the Cape Coast Sugar Babies quite important. Most people think that it was E.T. Mensah who took Highlife to Nigeria, and that's true, that the main introduction of Highlife was by E.T. Mensah in the 50s, but Ghanaians were already going to Nigeria as early as the late 1930s, and it was the Cape Coast Sugar Babies that was the first to do, and they went on, I think, various West African tours. So they became more famous, I would say, at least in West Africa, than many of the other groups. You see, the dance bands came out of the elite ballroom dance orchestras. For instance, E.T. Mensah, the king of dance band Highlife, got his training in the Accra Orchestra, Teacher Lamptey's Accra Orchestra, and his own brother's rhythmic orchestra, Accra Rhythmic Orchestra. So the dance bands have an origin within the elite bands. Although E.T. Mensah wasn't a member of the elite, that was the origin. And the people who were operating in the dance bands like Broadway, Uhuru, the Black Beats, of course starting with E.T. Mensah's tempos, could read music, Some of them had training in the ballroom dance orchestras. And they stayed in Accra, or they played in urban areas. When they traveled, they would go to, say, Kumasi or Takoradi. But the guitar bands have a completely different origin, totally, as different as, I don't know, oil and water. Because the guitar bands came from the fishermen, the poor folk, and it started as what we call the palm wine style. The Osibisaba style is sometimes called the palm wine style, because it moved from Cape Coast into the villages where people drink palm wine. And so the guitar bands were always associated with the urban poor and the rural people. And they were what we would call illiterate in terms of Western formal education or music education. So it was a completely different style. In fact, there are stylistic differences. The guitar bands actually have more African features in their music than do the dance bands. They use the modal system of playing. They will use the recitative, that is the proverbial way of singing, not in verses like European music or dance band highlights. So there were quite substantial differences, but the main thing is that there was two classes of highlife musicians who never met. They never interacted with, and they didn't even like each other. Just to prove the point, when Nkrumah encouraged the formation of a music union in Ghana in the late 50s and early 60s, two music unions sprang up. One for the more urban dance bands with their suits and ties, and E.T. Menson would be a very good example, but of course there were many of these bands. They could read music and so on. And then the guitar bands and the concert parties that they operated with was the other type. And the two, in Ghana, these two wings of highlife never met together until Musica was formed in 1974. I can tell you this from personal experience. You know, I was one of the founders of Musica. I was one of the founding 100 members who formed the Musica. But at that time, there was another musicians union that was specifically for the guitar bands. And there were just one or two of us who belonged to both, because my Bokor band was more of a guitar band than a dance band. But I joined the Musica because I was working with Faisal Helwani and Sami Odo. So I saw that there was a real split, and Nana Ampedu and all these guys at first wouldn't join the musicians union because that split between the guitar bands or concert party bands on the one hand and the dance bands was something to do with status. One was more high class, lower class, literate, illiterate, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, if you want to know, the reason why I got into trouble at Legon when I was a student for being a musician wasn't because I played highlife music, it's because I played with the guitar bands. And they were considered to be bush music for bush people, sleep on the floor, get drunk on palm wine. So there was a class distinction in Ghana between the two types. It was all called highlife by that time. Nana and Ampedu, Kukuseku, they're all called their music, or Yamwa, Onyina, is highlife. By that time, that was the general word. But there were two varieties. And it wasn't really until the Musicians Union, and then there was a very important show that Osibisa put together once. They had a policy of bringing guitar band musicians into the dance bands. And I think the Ramblers also did this on occasion. There were certain occasions where there was a leakage between the two types of highlife, but really the two wings of highlife didn't come institutionally together until the formation of the Musicians Union. And in the end, Nana Ampedu and the people who belonged to the guitar band union, and I've forgotten what we called it now, but I was a member of that as well. We all joined the Musicians Union, and we just had a single union for all highlife musicians. If we go back to the 50s, I mean, the first thing to say is that both the guitar band musicians and the dance band musicians all supported the independence struggle. So it wasn't that one was against independence or, you know, politically. They were all on the same wavelength. They were all Nkrumahist, if I can put it this way. So if we look at the guitar band first, I mean, the most important, it's difficult really to say, but I would say Ike Nyami is very Or Onyina. Onyina wrote a song called The Destiny of Africa, the Highlife, which was about the formation of what later became the African Union. Because you know, it was first of all instigated by Nkrumah. He called meetings here in Accra, I think in 1958, with Lumumba and others, and Sekaturi, to set up that. So, and a lot of the guitar bands supported Kwame. I can give you so many examples of guitar bands, and not only the guitar bands, but the concert parties that the theatrical groups they sometimes worked with, also put on plays in favor of Nkrumah. So, it's difficult for me to say, but Ike would be the outstanding one. Kwame, he wrote a song when Nkrumah was brought out of prison in 1952, I think. You know, the British locked him up. There was also Bob Cole. Bob Cole was a Highlife singer and a concert comedian, and he had a band called the Ghana Trio that also, in fact, he was so close to Nkrumah that when Nkrumah was overthrown, he was arrested. I mean, so that was on the guitar band side. So if you take Onyina, Yamwa, all these people, they were pro-CPP in the early days. Then at the same time, the dance band musicians, the top names would, of course, have to mention E.T. Mensah first, the tempos. And he played at CPP rallies. He brought out songs like Ghana Freedom Highlife, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and so on. So, and then of course, this was followed by other bands like the Ramblers that came out with Work and Happiness, or the Uhuru Band that was almost an official band of the CPP. So both the guitar bands and the dance bands and those early pioneers were aligned with the CPP in the early days, the independence struggle and the early era of Nkrumah. Well, it was really, if I can put it this way, it was really the soundtrack of the independence struggle. And not just in Ghana. Nigeria the same, because when Highlife went from Ghana to Nigeria, it became so Nigerianized that in their independence celebrations, it also featured Highlife music and not Western ballroom music and so on. I could take it back to maybe the late 1940s. Let me give you one specific example. There was a type of Highlife called Konkoma music, which was a sort of a poor man's Highlife. And it was played by a concert party that was formed by Ghanaian soldiers fighting in Burma. You know, I don't know if your listeners or viewers know this, but about 46,000 or 45,000 Ghanaians fought in the Second World War. I mean active service with weapons. 90,000 Nigerians fought, and altogether 1/3 Africans fought in the Second World War against fascism, particularly against the Japanese. Now, because there were so many Africans fighting in Indochina and Burma and so on, they formed their own entertainments. And they had an African theatre that was run by, I think it was Bob Vance and some others. They were soldiers, but in their spare time, they put on concert parties and accompanied themselves with Konkoma Highlife. So we're talking during the Second World War itself. And they staged obviously in pidgin English, because they wanted all the African troops. So when these guys came back to Ghana in 1945 after the war, they formed what they called the Burma Trio. Just like we have Burma Camp, we had the Burma Trio, or Trio. So it's a sort of a musical group and theatrical group. Then in 1948, something happened which changed everything as far as Ghana is concerned, and the British. That was the shootings at Christiansburg Castle. Now, what happened then? As you know, immediately that happened, the British lost their nerve. And you know, those Ghanaian soldiers weren't trying to overthrow the British. They just wanted to back pay for the effort they had made during the war. So it wasn't even overtly political when it started. They were going for pay, which they were owed by the British government. So the British made the mistake of shooting some of them, lootings all over Accra and Ghana. The whole, you know, shops were burning, Lebanese and British shops were burning. And the Burma Trio decided to change its name to the Ghana Trio in 1948. This is before Ghana became officially recognized as Ghana. I mean, Dankwa invented the name Ghana for modern Ghana, but it wasn't used as an institutional name in Ghana until Ghana became independent. And so one of the first cases we have of the word Ghana being used by an institution here is a concert party, a guitar band. And they call themselves the Ghana Trio. Later on, Bob Cole came to run that band. But what I'm saying is that you can see how close, and some of the concert parties and guitar bands, and as they were roaming around the country, were banned by the British for putting on subversive plays. These are sort of Highlife plays. So you can see, so right from the beginning, Highlife played a role in the independence struggle, which explains why Nkrumah favored Highlife when he came to power, because it's what they call a quid pro quo. You help me, I will help you. So at a basic level, the Highlife bands, whether guitar band, concoma bands, the concert parties, the dance bands, they threw their lot in with Nkrumah and the CPP. So Nkrumah also tried to help them in so many ways, setting up state Highlife bands and concert parties, setting up Ghana Films with a very fine recording studio, and so on, encouraging the formation of music unions. So you can say that Highlife was very deeply involved in the nationalist struggle. If you take Western music, a lot of it is about love, right? Romantic, odo. That's 90% of Western music is about this. But with that, and now if you say, let's say, with Highlife today, maybe a lot of it's, or Afro-pop, or whatever you want to call it, a lot of it's about odo. But back in those days, odo was not the main topic of conversation. It was the independence of Ghana was very important. Philosophical questions such as the meaning of life and death, problems within your marriages, problems between the genders maybe, because there were very few women in Highlife back in those days, and commentaries on witchcraft, orphans, Abusia Bone, Ajanka Jue. These were the type, and also drunkenness and prostitution, believe it or not. Because these are, a lot of your younger generations don't realize that a lot of the problems we have in Ghana, you didn't have them in the traditional days. For instance, you never had orphans. Everybody belonged to a family in Ghana. If you were truly an orphan in Ghana 100 or 500 years ago, you were dead. Okay? So suddenly, because of the breaking up of the traditional extended family under the pressure of colonialism, thousands of orphans appeared. We call them now street children. They didn't exist. So the Highlife people had to make plays and songs about Ajankas and Awisias and about orphan children, because it was a new development. Or if you take the development of alcoholism, drunkenness, basically Ghanaians used to drink palm wine or pito in the north. You have to drink vast quantities to get intoxicated. Then the Europeans introduced apateshi and the distilling of alcohol. And then when you got the urbanization of Accra from the 1920s and 30s, it wasn't the families that moved from the rural areas, it was the man. The man in the rural area would move to the city to find work and maybe later on bring his wife. So you had many thousands of lonely young migrant workers, men, working in the cities in Kumasi and in Accra, Takoradi and so on. I'm talking about the 1920s, 30s and 40s and so on. So what do? They turn to drink and prostitutes because they've left their wives behind, their families behind, they're lonely and they don't know what to do. So these are problems. A lot of the songs were about these problems of urbanization. So you could almost say that Highlife not only gave voice to nationalist sentiments, but also expressed in a vernacular way, a critique of the modernization, urbanization, westernization that was going on in Ghana at the time. So it provided a social commentary. That's what not just in terms of political struggle or nationalism, but in a much, much broader way. And love, odo, was maybe 15% of the lyrics of Highlife back then. It's different now, but that's how it was. So I'm just saying that Highlife provided a social commentary in a very broad way for Ghanaians at a time when maybe you would say that they were illiterate or they didn't have their own history, but they were creating their own history, their own commentary in songs, just like the hip lifers are today, making commentaries about life today. They were making commentaries about life in those days. And what is so precious for Ghanaians, and in fact not just Ghanaians, but people all over the world, is that if you take all the Highlife songs that were recorded from the 1920s, by the poor people, made by the poor people, the rural people, who never wrote their histories, never wrote their thoughts down. Maybe they were illiterate. The professors and the doctors can write histories, but not the poor folk. Well, the poor folk wrote their histories in their music, and it was in the Highlife music. So you could almost say that from the folklore of traditional African music, you know, if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, traditional music is a repository of traditional wisdom, proverbs, sayings and so on, genealogies, histories and so on. You know, it was all embedded in music and performance. Well, the Highlife musicians simply continued that policy. And the poor people luckily had Highlife to express themselves. And now, today, a sociologist or political scientist or historian could go to the Highlife music records going back to the 1920s. And it's actually called the history of the inarticulate approach, gathering information from the people who never wrote down their histories. And of course, it doesn't just apply to Ghana, it applies to the popular music of Africa. So it's a vast resource that Ghanaian social scientists and politicians are sitting on.